Welcome to another episode of Preparing for the Unexpected. I'm your host, Alex Fullick, and as always, we like to talk about things related to business continuity, resilience, crisis management, anything that helps you, your organization, or your community prepare for, respond to, and overcome adverse situations. If you'd like to be a guest on the show, please feel free. You can find me on LinkedIn. I am the only Alex Fullick there. I'm really easy to find, and I do respond to everything I get. Now, today we've got a few topics to talk about, and my guest you will recognize back for her fourth appearance on the show, but about the 10th that she and I have worked together. Fourth on the show, though, Margaret Millett. Margaret, welcome back.
Hello, Alex. Thank you for having me back. I must be doing something right if I get to come back and connect with you again and look forward to future collaborations because, as you mentioned, we've done some other things live and in person at conferences.
Yeah, most recently, Continuity Resilience Today, we did a fireside chat. For
Yes, that was lovely to be back up in Toronto, Canada.
Yep, that was fun. It was great to see you. And then I saw you the following week in London, UK, for the BCI conference.
You were a little busier, though, because you were the master of ceremonies.
Yeah, I was a little bit busy. But it's great to see you. I'm glad that you're back on the show today. And as
Thank
I
you.
mentioned, we've got a few things to talk about. Why don't we just jump straight into our first one?
Okay.
And our first one is political instability and geopolitical risks. So my question is, what is that?
Well, a lot of people, I think, only realize that there is like a handful of elections taking place in 2024. And in reality, if you go do a little research, Alex, there's probably, I think, it is over 200. I don't know the exact number. I think it's like 220, 230, 240. So, it's not just what I'm going to say, big countries having changes in leadership. And so, as you know, anytime there's a change in leadership, there are changes in policies that are taking place or potential changes in policies that are going to be taking place. And how is that going to impact us doing business, traveling to those countries? And so, what I wanted to do is just talk about how we, as the continuity professional management profession, need to probably be keeping an eye on where we have our operations, understanding what's happening with those changing geopolitical situations, find out if there's anything that's going to be, I'm going to say, contentious. For example, I know that sometimes when things change in leadership, one of the things that they want to do is try and control the price of goods. So one of those things that can happen for you in the home country is the new leadership might impose higher tariffs, so that you can hopefully not has to pay as much for goods coming. Excuse me, I've got that wrong. I meant that they're going to impose higher tariffs on foreign goods so that people can feel better about buying things in their home country. And that can work well, or it may backfire. And so I think that's one thing that, people need to understand. And then it also starts to make us as continuity professionals really do that deeper dive of understanding more about the supply chains. As we know that sometimes this can also lead to disruption in our supply chains. It could also threaten the supply of our supply chains, depending on what the good is or the item that's coming out of a country. If it's a precious commodity, it may be under more scrutiny. Less of it may be produced, more of it may produce. The price might change. Those types of things. And then I think the other thing is also just really starting to understand what are your plans in place for every time there's now a change in leadership, because sometimes there's a smooth transition of power, sometimes there's not. And then how are you going to continue to operate your business, not only for the supply chain, but if it's in a country where you actually have employees that are operating on the ground there, how are you going to do it? And Alec, one other thing I really want to talk about, every time we hear one of these like natural disasters that have occurred, I'm going to say just in the last 3 months, what seems to be coming out is, we just have something that's being produced that's only produced in one area, or it's the second supplier, but there are no other suppliers of this good or service. So it's like, it does make you really understand how we as a society globally have put all our eggs in one or two baskets for products.
Yeah, that happens quite a bit. Look at the one that pops to my mind immediately is the Japanese tsunami back in, well, I guess that's what, 12, 13 years ago?
Yeah.
Something. And the only reason that pops into my mind so much is because down the road from where I live is a Toyota plant, and they had to shut operations down because most of the supplies they were getting were coming from Japan.
Wow. Well, even most recently, I live in North Carolina. And for those of you around the globe who may not be aware, North Carolina, Western North Carolina, I'm in Eastern North Carolina and I'm fine. But Western North Carolina had a major hurricane come through in August, Hurricane Helene. And it came out in the US news that basically there is a company there, and they're one of the sole producers of IV bags in the United States. And they have not been able to get back up to full production. And so hospitals in the United States are being very mindful of how they're using the distribution of IV bags. For example, one thing that they had on the news is, if you do have an accident and the emergency service people come in and start to give you an IV, I guess typically the protocol is when you arrive at the hospital, they'll switch out the fluid bag and start a new one. Now they're making sure that they're using that through the full usage before they give you a new bag. And then also, I guess for people after surgery, another thing to get the fluids into you is they give you an IV bag, and now they're just like, have a glass of water instead because they don't have enough IV bags to go around, and they don't know when it's going to be back into what I'm going to say full production. But again, you would think like, how could something so critical in the healthcare system have basically only one or two providers of something that's used daily around the world?
I think part of it comes down to cost these days. Oh, they're the
Yeah,
cheapest, just go for them, and then ignore everybody else. And then you have a disaster that occurs, like the situation you just mentioned in Western North Carolina,
yeah,
and all of a sudden there's this huge impact
yeah,
that are outside of the borders of North Carolina.
yeah. And I think it is one of those things when you are doing your continuity planning for 2025 is to really maybe start and, modify your plans to say to the people who own these relationships, who is your secondary provider if something happens to them? Because I think the other thing is it's not easy to go out and find somebody. And if you've been relying on, the ABC IV bag company for years, you just think, well, they're always going to be there. But if it's also one of those where it's a product or service that's not provided, frequently or well known to who the extra suppliers are, then yeah, you could be needing to get some new contracts in place and figuring out how you're going to keep the supply chain going for your organization, or in this case, the medical industry.
You think sometimes it's a little bit of complacency sets in? We've never had an issue
Oh,
with
definitely.
ABC supplier, so we don't need to worry about them. But we have heard stories about such and such, so they go look somewhere else, or focus somewhere else. But then something happens to ABC supplier, and it's like, uh-oh, now what?
Well, I'm going to say this, Alec. I think that, for most people in North Carolina, the fact that the storm changed course and went so far inland was totally unexpected. You would not think that far inland, meaning it basically, I'm already like an hour and a half in from the coast, and for me to get to Asheville is 4 hours from where I live. So that's how far in it went. You would think like it's safe because it's in the mountains, it's fine. But I just look at it as nobody, no matter where you are in the world, is safe anymore with climate change and not knowing what's going to happen in the future. Because I'm going to say this, you keep hearing how there's like no rain in the northeast corridor of the United States. About some fires going on in New Jersey and in New York right now. And again, governors are saying, don't put out your cigarettes. Just don't flick your cigarette. And also, they don't want you starting fires in your home now that it's getting to be cooler temperatures because they're afraid if something sparks out of your chimney, you could start a major fire.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you think, what are your thoughts, sorry, with resilience professionals or business continuity professionals, whatever name you want to give them? What are your suggestions to those individuals trying to keep their eyes on everything? Because for the most part, many of us are departments of one, maybe two,
Yeah,
and it's only the big consulting firms who have big groups of business continuity people,
yeah.
but then they're broken down into these three focus on this and those three focus on that. But departments of one, how can we wrap our heads around some of this? because
Oh, you
particularly
are
BIAs and yeah.
so spot on, all of this of, being asked to do more with less. I'm going to say really start leveraging your security centers, Alex, because I'm hoping that most organizations still do have what I'm going to say the 24/7, 365 security centers. And usually they've got more people who are monitoring what's happening, but also expand the monitoring capabilities, meaning it's great if you're in New York City to see what's just happening, with the subway system today, but start looking at what's happening around the world that could be impacting your organization. And I do think vendor management needs to, step up the plate on looking at, when you are going to go engage with a company, to find out from the person who is engaging, like, okay, if something does happen to them, who else do you then want to sign on the dotted line with? Because I think oftentimes you're right, we get complacent with the ABC company, but we really need to start to think about if something's going to happen. And I think that needs to be built into what I'm going to say, having good vendor management hygiene, that you do need to now start and think about who your secondary supplier might need to be. And you also really do need to figure out more about who the third and fourth parties are from your vendors, because you don't know where they're getting something from. I mean, I'm going to go back to the IV bags. I don't know enough about how you make an IV bag, but let's face it, they probably also rely on others to help supply the content of making the entire bag. So therefore, where are they getting it from? What happens if something happens to one of their suppliers? Maybe they get something, say, from Latin America. What happens if something happens with production there? You're still stuck holding the bag, no pun intended, of not being able to get the IV bags out. So
Mhm.
I do think it's more, more than just signing the contract and saying, yep, I'm good to go. I've got all my ducks in a row and I have all this faith in this company. Because not that you don't have faith in the company, but I just think that we have to get realistic. It's not a matter of if, but it's more of a matter of when something's going to go wrong. And even if it's not, production issues that, it impacts them. I mean, what happens if there's a strike? These types of things. We talked about going back to the geopolitical. What happens if all of a sudden you are getting something from another country and all of a sudden there's a 15% increase in the import duties? That may mean that vendor is now too expensive for you to go use, or you've got to, reduce how much you're bringing in, because you can't just eliminate a contract because there's a change in the tariffs, but you then may need to go outsource some of it to another vendor. And I do think it's one of those of, you should have a well-distributed sense of how you're getting your goods and services in, because let's face it, your volume can change. And therefore, somebody else might not be able to make that peak delivery for you, because let's face it, there's always going to be a bigger supplier or a bigger customer that's going to want the goods and services that may get something over you. And so therefore you've got to be prepared, to be able to meet that need.
I like something you mentioned there about reaching out to security groups or sorry, the security center. You mentioned procurement and
Yeah.
the vendor management. It's not necessarily we as resilience professionals taking charge of that or really getting our fingers into every pie, but just posing the questions to like, hey,
Yeah.
FYI guys, you need to look at this, or are there any concerns we should be, worried about?
Well, and I'm going to continue to say this, Alex, we shouldn't be the only ones who are thinking about how we want to ensure that the organization can operate across, whether I'm going to say calm or volatile regions across the world. We need to all be putting on that lens of looking at what do we need to do in order to continue to keep the lights on for whatever we do to help contribute to the organization. And it shouldn't be just us as the resiliency profession. And, I look at it today, Alex, it's so easy to just go Google the ABC company to
Mm.
find out about them. And that I'm going to say this, I do think that that should be part of, vendor management or supply chains responsibility, is to be looking at these companies to find out, what's happening. Is there a change in leadership? Are they actually changing who they do business with? And that, constituted a news article. Because I'm going to say this, like you said, like years ago, there was Toyota. I know during COVID, Apple had trouble manufacturing a chip in China. We all hear about how there's this single point of failure. And you would think that by now we would have all learned our lesson, but clearly we haven't.
No, sometimes we really have to be hit over the head with a sledgehammer before anything actually really sinks in.
Yeah.
We only have 1 minute left, believe it or not.
Okay.
Do you have any final thoughts on political instability and geopolitical risks?
Well, I'm going to say this, even though I talked about how there was a lot of political change happening in the world this year, there are going to be elections next year and the year after that. So realize that this is something that we all need to keep abreast of, and that we need to be figuring out what we need to consider for where we operate, where we're going to go operate, and even where we might go visit to find out about potential new opportunities for our organizations.
Well, on that note, we've come to the end. Thank you very much, Margaret, talking about political instability and geopolitical risks. In our next segment, we're going to be talking about talent.
Thank you.
We'll be right back.
Thanks, Alex.
If you liked that video, thumbs up. If you didn't like that video, thumbs down. But leave me a message and let me know your thoughts. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And in the meantime, stay prepared, everybody.